Good evening, everybody. My name is Jaimey Fisher, and I'm the director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, as well as faculty in German and Cinema and Digital Media. Welcome to our book chat. The DHI likes to offer these book chats to promote the work of our faculty here at UC Davis. A large part of what we do, obviously, as faculty is create kind of cutting edge knowledge, and our books are the showcase for that. And we like to really get into the books and give our audience an opportunity to learn about the projects, hear about the genesis of these projects, and engage the author in the topics that are discussed in those books. I'm really glad tonight to have Lorena Oropeza, professor in the Department of History and also Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Diversity at UC Davis. Before we get started, though, we like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. Today, there are three federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Cacho-Dihi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian community, the Quetzal-Dihi Wintun Nation, and the Yocha-Dihi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Also, before we get started, I want to send a special thank you to Gina Nunes for helping out with the book chat. She does a great job as always, so we're really grateful for her assistance. So our guest today is Lorena Oropeza. She is Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Diversity and a professor in the Department of History at UC Davis. As a historian, she studies people who during the 1960s raised hell because they wanted to stop a war or fight racial injustice or overthrow patriarchy. She was attracted to history as a field because, like those 1960s activists, she believes in the subversive potential of history to interrogate received wisdom. She's the author of The King of Adobe, tonight's topic, as well as Razazi Guerano, Chicano Protest Patriotism During the Vietnam War Era. She's the recipient of the 2018 American Historical Association Equity Prize for her efforts to make her field a more inclusive and diverse place. As Associate Vice Chancellor, she's had the opportunity to extend her commitment to diversity campus-wide. Specifically, she works with a fabulous team of people in the DEI Office of Academic Diversity who are committed to strengthening and broadening the academic pipeline from undergraduate scholars to the faculty who serve them. And she's here tonight with us to discuss her book, The King of Adobe, The Lost Prophet of the Chicano Movement from University of North Carolina Press. Lorena, it's wonderful to have you here tonight and to discuss this great book and this really fascinating figure of Reies Tijerina, who went from running a utopian religious community in rural Arizona to being one of the few Latinos to attend the funeral of Martin Luther King. So really tracing his arc from kind of a hardscrabble preacher to one of the highest profile figures in the 1960s protest movement. And along the way, I think you engaged some really essential questions about kind of the role of history, how historians approach difficult, complicated topics, and we'll get into that in a second. Before we begin the questions, though, I think our format will be, I will ask questions after hearing from you, reading from you. I'll ask questions for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions from the audience, if that's okay. And I think you brought along a passage to read, to give us a sense of, I think, really a wonderfully written book, one that's highly readable and completely engaging. So if you don't mind, take it away.
I'll take it away. And first of all, I'm going to say thank you so much for this invitation. I think I'm the one who said, hey, can you invite me? And so that was me trying to be a self-promoter. It's really not natural or comfortable. And yet I'm very proud of this book. So I really appreciate all the kind words you said. And also, I appreciated having a DHI quarter-length fellowship to just nip the end of it. That was a really extraordinary community and was super helpful. And thank you, Jaimey, for all the good work you do. It's a treasure. You run a center that's a campus treasure. I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called The Prophet. And here we go. In late 1955, Reies López Tijerina and a small group of devoted followers pooled their meager resources to buy 160 desert acres some 6 miles outside of Casa Grande, Arizona. With only the outline of some low-slung mountains in the distance to break the monotony, the harsh landscape mostly featured gray-green shrubs, stunted trees, and hard-packed earth. In this place, which he later described as, quote, the wildest spot I could find, end quote, Tijerina sought to build a community where he and his followers, I'm gonna, instead of doing the end quotes and quotes, I'm just gonna do this. Not that I'm questioning my writing, but it's better. where he and his followers wouldn't trouble others and we wouldn't be bothered ourselves. He named the settlement Valle de Paz, or Valley of Peace. Working like ants moving the earth, Tijerina recalled that he and the other men literally used their hands to begin to carve out a new life for themselves and their families. They constructed subterranean homes using the hoods and trunk lids of abandoned cars that they found in local dumps to reinforce the ceilings. It took Tijerina probably 2 months to carve out a room-sized bunker for his wife and children, one deep enough to allow everyone to stand upright. Determined to make the religious utopia a reality, Valle de Paz members pulled their money together to stock a common pantry. Our lives in the Valle de Paz were simple, Tijerina asserted years later, but together residents were striving to create what he called a paradise. The following spring, a torrential rainfall threatened to undo all of their progress. At the time, Tijerina was visiting Visalia, California, where he had been invited to preach at a local church and where he hoped to find new recruits for his utopian experiment. A phone call from a Valle de Paz resident informed him that massive flooding had swept through the community. The water had completely inundated the bunker that housed Mary Escobar, his wife, and their children, and had swept away all of the family's possessions. His wife was now living beneath a tree with their 5 children, including a newborn whom she had just delivered with only Tijerina's help the week before. Drenched and desperate, Escobar awaited her husband's return. Upon hearing this bad news, I cried, Tijerina remembered years later. He was moved to tears, not by concern of the plight of his family, but by worry about what this tragic turn of events portended about his relationship with God. He thought, my God, how could you do this to me? For 10 years, I have dedicated myself to you, and this is how you reward me? That night, he received an answer in the form of another vision, one that he infused with so much significance that Tijerina always referred to it as a revelation or a super dream. And he included it among the many major milestones, which he called pilares in his life. That's milestone in Spanish. More than 50 years later, he would still recount details of this dream. Quote, 3 angels flew down from space, one after the other, coming down at an angle toward me. He recalled in 2010, they had come to take me to an ancient kingdom. In the dream, Mary Escobar grudgingly asked the angels, why him? The angels responded, he is the only one who can do this mission. In this version of events that he related in 2010, Tijerina portrayed Escobar as particularly shrewish. Also new was that she was sweeping when she spoke to the angels. Sweeping is an archetypical domestic task. Literally and metaphorically, Tijerina was placing his former wife firmly in her place. Otherwise, his recollection paralleled almost verbatim the description of this vision that he offered many, many times before. The dream Tijerina asked the angels, what is the mission? And the angels answered, secretary. Before Tijerina awoke, he said, he experienced the sensation of being lifted through the air to an ancient kingdom. He saw tall pines and a cemetery of frozen horses. He entered a walled city. Finally, he met an old man dressed in white robes who told him that Tijerina was to reign over this kingdom. Above you, only me, said the figure. In 2010, when asked if the figure was God, Tijerina only smiled coyly and shrugged his shoulders as if to say the answer was so obvious they did not need to speak of it.
Very wonderful. Yeah, I didn't plan to begin here, but I think because that passage is so powerful and I think so telling for this book, I want to start by asking you kind of what form you decided to write in, because I think kind of officially it's a biography and we do get the arc of Tijerina's kind of amazing life. But also you can see here the book pushing against, I think, a couple of things. One is Tijerina's personality, which is quite complicated as you fully engage in the book. I think that's one of the things really to admire about the book is the way that you did engage him in all these different, very complicated, sometimes disturbing facets. And then also his religiosity, which I think is very often left out of accounts, academic accounts. I think, for understandable reasons, it's difficult to talk about, it's difficult to grasp, but it's hard to imagine this story without that aspect of his personality. So I was wondering if you could say some about, I guess, one, something you raise in this passage, his complex, I guess, attitudes about women, and then two, his religiosity.
Wow. Okay. So that passage, if those two things came out, then the whole book came out. That's it.
Yeah.
So, one piece of the book argues is that you can't understand Tijerina unless you understand his attitude towards women. And so I guess a major argument is that women are essential to the success. His success as what was called a land grant leader. He was a leading Chicano movement figure, but he wanted to reclaim land that was now owned by Americans, land that Mexicans had owned prior to 1848. So he had the chance to develop his ideas because he really exploited and abused women in his family. And that was really related. I think that gender and the God portion in his mind were, you couldn't divorce them, right? Because when he looked at the Bible, when he thought what was the right role for women, it was that they were supposed to be sexually pure. They were supposed to obey men. They were supposed to make themselves available and make lots of babies. I mean, this was their role. And because, so that was where Mary Escobar is in the dream segment. She is just there sweeping in support of his vision. And then the religiosity, is usually an easier word before 5 p.m. in the evening, is that was just, he, like, from the first chapter talks about the first time he visited Jesus. I mean, Tijerina just had this really strong foundation that, like, he was chosen for a mission, and his job was just to figure out what it was. And he was willing to use every resource he had and everyone he could to get closer to that mission's achievement. So to write about Tijerina without writing about how he treated women, or to write about Tijerina without talking about how firmly he saw his life as part of God's plan, and how desperately he saw himself as a really important figure. That's my dog in the background, sorry. And I'm gonna let her out just a second. It's impossible.
Of course.
I have a very fearsome Shih Tzu who someone came in the front door, so there you go. But I thought to me, one of the interesting things is everything I left out when it comes to Tijerina and women and Tijerina's religiosity. You know, there's a complete weeding process. The book is fairly long, and it could have been longer, but I didn't need to belabor some of these points. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think toward the end of the book, you discuss this issue of how to really raise and incorporate his attitudes towards women. And I think you mentioned a senior scholar telling you, I don't see what this has to do with the land grant issue, which of course is that for which he's probably most famous. And I think that you really elegantly handle it in the book. And it's one of the things that's really fascinating about the book, because he does have this kind of marquee fame for the courthouse raid and his activism around land grant claims in the Southwest. Which is, I think, what he's probably best known for, what people might know about. Maybe you should say a little bit about that, and then we can get into how you answer some of these trickier questions. Yeah.
So, yeah, because it was a discovery for me. I mean, if I had known I would have gotten in so much dirt, I'm not sure I would have picked this topic. It was really hard. It was really upsetting. It was really difficult. And there were times when people who are not historians said, well, why are you writing about this guy? And the reason was that he was both repulsive and utterly fascinating. Like, I really do think he was a brilliant, like, given his lack of education, given the way he was self-taught, his ability to look at the US past and think critically about it, he was fascinating. So I started with him, like, it was from my first book, Raza Ciguera. No, it was about him protesting the Vietnam War. That's where I started with Tijerina. But I quickly found out that, in fact, the first people I interviewed were his first wife, and I can even say his first ex-wife, and his eldest daughter. And they introduced this whole other aspect of his religious vision and his treatment towards women that I couldn't ignore. I tried. I mean, I really tried, just because it was so difficult. And at one point, I think I'd written maybe 100 pages. And truly, because New Mexico has such a long history of Spanish-speaking people living there, I like raced back to 1598 and I was writing 100 pages. Like there was this like the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And eventually I had to you just had to deal with it and center it. It's really the wisdom of fellow historians in the department. In fact, this was particularly Beverly Bosser said this has to be part of the book. I'm saying like, oh, I can keep it out in like an oral history methodological piece. I don't have to deal with the fact that his it is incest. His eldest daughter accuses him of sexual abuse. And when I interviewed him, he said that he didn't sexually abuse her. He did one time touch her intimately, but that was just to check her virginity. So and then when I would present this stuff, because it was scandalous and it made for like great presentations, and people say like, was he like Jim Jones? Was he like, what I mean? Like they would try to figure him out. He's also a hero to a lot of people. He really inspired a lot of people. So that's why a senior, a veterano, and I really mean that because the first generation of Chicano scholars, really veterans of the Chicano movement, he says, well, what the hell does this matter, right? And I think it matters. And what I came down to is that people are complicated and you have to you can't ignore pieces that are uncomfortable. In fact, you can't understand Tijerina unless you really understand how he treated women and what he thought of them, because it explains how he ran his organization, explains why it fell apart so rapidly, explains why he's so quickly, like the courthouse raid, like puts him into all of a sudden a spot of national attention, but also why like people stop listening to him. He's like, he's saying some really odd things and he's writing some really odd things too. And it's a straight line. It doesn't vary. Like if you look at his sermons from 1954, it's like, women need to be seen and not heard, and they need to be virgins. And then I remember being in Mexico once, and he would scrawl all these lectures. I was just traveling just for fun with my aunt, and I was always working on this book. I was always trying to figure him out. So, I'll just translate some of his lectures, but I'm looking at it, and it's like my aunt is there, and her Spanish is, she grew up speaking, and I grew up learning it. And so it's like, Manuka, am I reading this right? She goes, oh yeah. So the penis, the organ that will destroy the world. And that was like a sermon that he was writing in the 1970s after his fame. But that straight line is there. And the reason the penis is going to destroy the world is not that men are lustful, but women are lusting after that sexual organ. That was the point of his lecture, of his sermon.
I think there's a very important lesson there, I think, for us as scholars, for our students, that sometimes subjects remain highly contradictory and ever elusive. I mean, there's no just sort of getting it, understanding it, categorizing it. One has to engage, I think, these subjects in all their complexity to even start to get at the history. Could you say just a little bit more about actually the land claim grants and the land grant claims, and what sort of the context in which he was working, which he became most famous, which was in sort of northern New Mexico and related to this long history of the Spanish Empire, then the U.S. and Mexican War?
Sure, we got to his why people would find him repulsive, but this is why, that was kind of the hidden history. People didn't know that. What they did know was this was a man who, he's Texas born. He does become a Pentecostal minister. He wanders the country for about 10 years. He also passes through northern New Mexico in some of his journeys. And northern New Mexico was a heart of Spanish-speaking civilization from the time of the earliest Spanish conquistadores, the ones like Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. And the people began to settle there, Spanish-speaking colonists began to settle there in 1598. They're kicked out in 1680, they come back in 1696. And so 1692 and 1696. So there's a long history of people living there, and it's where most Spanish speakers live. Like we think about sometimes in California, some people will know the word Californio, so they'll know the missions. Those were like late starts compared to New Mexico. And California, maybe at the time of the US-Mexico War of 1848, where northern Mexico becomes the American Southwest, had maybe 4,000 people. New Mexico maybe had 100,000, and they'd been there much longer. And so there's deep, like longer than there's been in the United States even today. So there's a deep, deep rooted tradition and an affiliation to the land in northern New Mexico. And at the time it went up to southern Colorado, that border is a US creation. And so what happened once the Americans literally came in, once there was an American conquest with the war, is that people who'd lived on that land for generations quickly saw their land move into the hands of either private American individuals or the American government in the form of the U.S. Forest Service claiming forest land. And I think the major reason is really interesting. The way you survive in northern New Mexico is really, it can be romanticized, but there is a communal land tradition. Like, you have to share meager resources to get by. But that idea of the commons was reinterpreted by the US Supreme Court to mean that the commons was land held in common by the King of Spain, then the Republic of Mexico, then the US government, now the US Forest Service. So it ended up that people are still on the land, but they have to go ask the forest ranger, can I have a cow? Can I like raise my horse here? They also have to deal with all sorts of other much more wealthy Americans, or Anglo-Americans, or coming in and saying, nope, this land is mine. I have a title and it's better than yours. So the upshot is, by the time Tijerina comes there by the late 1950s, after his failed utopian religious experience in Arizona, there's already it's already one of the poorest sites in the country. Like, there's people die younger, they earn less money, they have less education. They have more health problems. It is really, really a forgotten and impoverished sector of the American national fabric. And it's also one where, like, they were at the end of the ropes. Like, every court had told them again and again, forget it, it's not your land, go away. And that's when he enters the picture and he goes, I have a solution. We're going to form a great alliance. We're going to work together and we're going to get the land back. And he was such an inspirational preacher that they started to listen. And he had some really powerful arguments.
So when he formed this organization, the Alianza, right, around, in the mid 60s, and then it was this group that was involved in the courthouse raid. And I mean, one of the things that I think is really also, I think, revealing about the book is the relationship between the movement, of which he saw himself a part, but also in many ways the center, the relationship of that kind of movement to an individual who is, I think, by all accounts in the book, really a charismatic leader. I mean, he's able to convince people in that religious community to live really in the middle of nowhere in really difficult circumstances. So I think that's one of the recurring and powerful themes of the book. One thing I think also that, I mean, you're underselling the book to say that the two themes that I pulled out of your passage are really the core of the book, because there are many things this book does. And I think it's really inspiring for the many different things it accomplishes. One of the things I was thinking about when reading it was something that I try to teach my graduate students, I was just doing a graduate seminar this quarter, is, you should think about the way your work weighs in on kind of ongoing scholarly debates. I mean, that's what really I think in grad school is largely about, becoming an academic is about, is thinking about the ongoing scholarly debates that are unfolding, in our own time. And this book weighs in on, I think, really two fascinating and important long-term themes, probably themes that you've worked on, but I think it's really worth underscoring. One is about the sense of the US West as part of an American empire, that the American imperial project unfolded also within what we think of now as the borders of the US. But Tijerina really saw almost presciently that that was happening much earlier than people thought about, before colonial projects outside the borders of the US or even the contemporary borders of the US. That happened internally within what we consider now the territory of the US. And the other one, the second theme, I think, is what this all means for kind of protest culture of the 1960s. Because this kind of American original ended up intersecting, as I said, the kind of marquee figures of American protest culture, like Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers, et cetera. So I think how do you think Tijerina helps us rethink those two ongoing scholarly debates?
Well, I think that Tijerina has never gotten credit up until this book for his brilliance. Like, there was a flurry of earlier books, for his brilliance specifically in critiquing and naming American empire within the national boundaries. And so there was a series of books right after the courthouse raid, the one event that launched him to fame because he picked up a gun. He and his members of the Alliance conducted a shootout at a county courthouse, and that was in 1967. But as early as 1957, as early as 1955, in some of his sermons, he's naming American empire and seeing it as an evil. And so what I find really, I think one reason I was able to pick that up and see it as so important is that I was a scholar of American empire. That's what I studied in graduate school. I did not study Chicano history. I studied US expansion. And one of my first questions, because I really was someone who came in, you know, with a lot of catching up to do. It wasn't my history was not my major as an undergraduate. Like when I was a TA for the first, U.S. diplomatic history to 1912 or something. I think that's what it was called. Um, I asked Walt Lefebvre, who's my advisor, he just passed away this year. Like, why aren't there any books about Native Americans? Like, that's also like part of the diplomatic. And then, I kid you not, the next time we taught the class, there was a book about U.S. conversations with the Iroquois. So, the Tijerina could see that. In given his limited education and given the time where, this was the US Cold War and rah rah US and the evil empires, what Reagan said was the evil empire was the US, the Soviet Union. It wasn't the United States. The United States was this beacon of democracy. So I guess the way I teach it to my students oftentimes is that for a long time, and it's changed a great deal in part because of the social movement of the 1960s, but American history is often taught like there's these pilgrims and then people start moving west. So it's this it's all about westward expansion. And what Theodore did was he talked about this expansion in terms of people who are already there. And so it's one of the reasons why he felt it so oppressive, this expansion, and so unjust, because it entailed land loss and also because it entailed denigrating an entire culture, right? It was at a time when you were hit when you spoke Spanish in class. It was a time when to be Mexican was to seen to be a member of a culture of poverty. Like there's an entire deficit model that came with it, and he thought he traced it all to this ugly American empire that was belittling people like him, taking away their resources. And so his ability to say, like, the problem isn't us. There's nothing wrong with us. The problem is that those incoming Americans and their attitudes and their greed, that's a problem. That was just a really revolutionary way to look at things. And then it's really interesting because when you say, like, where does he intersect with the social movements of the 1960s? On the one hand, he is so far out there in terms of really seeing, like, being able to name empire, being able to dismissing, like, it's really like the hippie movement of the 1960s, like material wealth is not where it's at, right? There has to be more meaning to life. He was already there. But on the other hand, he is really extremely conservative, right? When you look at the right today, the biggest, like the evangelicals who are like huge supporters of our former president, a lot of them are Pentecostals. He was a Pentecostal. So he had a kind of a social aspect towards women. In political aspects, he was much more, I guess we would say progressive or willing to challenge the status quo.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll pose one more question, then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat window or the Q&A function. Another, I think, fascinating thing about the book, and this gets back to what I was raising before about the form of the book, kind of intention between biography and history. It's a highly historically informed biography, I would say. I think another really elegant thing you do in the book is give us these very different perspectives he has, also on his own kind of racial identity and how he thought about his own race. And I think in many ways that's a red thread through the book because the different chapter titles refer to different aspects of himself that he himself sees and emphasizes differently at different moments. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can say that when I figured out how to organize the book according to the different facets of Tijerina's personality and political emphasis and racial identities, I figured out that, oh my God, I can finish this. Because when you come to a man as complicated as Tijerina, what you have is like these 70-page monster chapters that are nothing but qualifications, right? So the way I was complaining to someone is like, he's someone who could like get on a plane saying things were great and get off the plane saying they're terrible. And which is one level of complication. And then he kept writing about everything he did because he was really the focus of his own life. But you had to decide what version of his life you wanted to pick. Mm-hmm. And then it was just like making your way through a nest. And there really were 80 boxes, most of it in his own words, writing again and again about himself. So just layers of stuff to make your way through. What I found really interesting is that you draw a distinction between biography and history, and I don't know that distinction. I think that's fascinating. to me, biography has to be historically informed, but there's probably something else going on there. What I will say is that I actually have sometimes have a hard time remembering all of the chapters, but at least sometimes, and I think at his heart, Tijerina was a Mexican. He really identified with the Mexican nation as someone born in Texas. There's also a chapter where he decides he's going to be a patriotic American for political reasons. One of his most interesting propositions is he develops a word that's still popular in some sectors in New Mexico, an Indo-Hispano. So you can imagine if all these Spanish-speaking people say like, we want our land back. You have all these Native American people in New Mexico saying, you stole it in the first place, and a whole bunch of other people, right? And so to acknowledge the racial complexity of what it means to be Mexican or what it means to be Nuevo Mexicano, someone from New Mexico, that was really, I don't know how else to put it, revolutionary as well, because honestly, the way that most immigrants who have the luxury get ahead in the United States is by hating Black people and claiming whiteness. Like, this is a ticket to get ahead. And for a long time, there were certain Mexican American leaders who, if they didn't hate Black people, knew at least it was smart enough to disengage from them. And you also disengage from Native Americans from the same reason. He didn't do that. He had his own prejudice. So I'm not saying that he didn't, but he saw the political utility, and he saw a certain collection of shared interest with African Americans, and particularly because both were like seen as land-based struggles with Native Americans. So that was part of his complexity, was to have that, you know, he's Indo-Hispano and he's Mexican and he's American.
Sorry, I have a child knocking at the door. And I think it anticipates also, and then helps formulate Chicano identity right into the 60s and 70s. And I think his relationship, because I think even part of the subtitle of the book, I should show the very pretty book that the lovely cover and the nice form of the book, refers to the lost prophet of the Chicano movement. But I think he has yet again a kind of complex, fraught relationship with the Chicano movement. So
yeah, they didn't listen to everything he said, so that was a problem. Yeah, he didn't even like the word Chicano, but he was okay with getting a lot of adoration and praise. You know, as long as he got the stage, he was okay. But personally, he didn't even like the word Chicano. Yeah.
Good. Another thing I was thinking of when reading it was that the kind of archive of the book also is kind of fascinating, and because this is another topic I discussed with my graduate students, is thinking about kind of what archive you're going to utilize when you are undertaking a kind of dissertation or book length project. And it's really impressive, I think, that you both incorporate kind of archival sources, documentary sources, but also interviews with a lot of the key players. And I can imagine that was difficult to navigate. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, how you pursued those, how you decided to incorporate them. If there are any interesting moments or challenges that came up from those interviews?
Yeah, there are, and I'm looking at the chat. There's no questions. I'm just going to tell you a story about doing oral history under these circumstances, because I thought it was. If you look really carefully at the book, the interviews with, and you can tell one, it took a long time to put together. The interviews with Mary Escobar, Tijerina's first wife, and Rosa Tijerina, she likes Rose better. His eldest daughter, occurred in 2006, 2007. I don't interview Tijerina until 2010. And I met him before. I met him on the 40th anniversary of the courthouse raid. I met him in his burnt out home in Coyote, New Mexico. And he was there just railing. He was in a lawn chair, and he had a big belly because his heart didn't work very well. So he had a lot of water accumulation. And I remember him saying today, and again, it goes back to today, women paint themselves from the tip of their head to the tip of their toes. He didn't like hair color. He didn't like nail polish. It was and I'm being okay, I have brown hair and I'm wearing tennis shoes. I'm in good shape here. But when he found out I was a historian all the way from California, he was really, really wanting to talk to me. And we talked a little bit that day, and we talked later, but it was always, and I'm saying this in quotation marks, the Jews. It was nonstop anti-Semitism. So I've heard some historians say oh, he wasn't anti-Semitic. It's oh yeah, he was anti-Semitic, especially by 2007, if not before. And so, and then I talked to but by then I'd already talked to Mary and Rose and done those interviews, which was really by chance, just knowing people, new people, knocking on doors. like cold knocking. And so it was graduate students who told me that I really needed to go and talk to Tijerina himself. Like the 80 boxes that he wrote, none of them said, this is what I did with my daughter, or this is, you know what I mean? And so it was a really a scary proposition. Less scary because he was already 80 some and not as strong as he used to be. I talked to Rudy Wusto, who was a man who wrote an earlier book about Tijerina's religious vision, but he didn't have access to any documents. And he also didn't talk about women at all. And I think that hurt his undertaking. But he said when he went to interview Tijerina, the man was like swinging an axe and cutting firewood. He was really careful what he asked because he didn't want that axe to come towards him. So I was dealing with a much frailer version. But what happened is that he sat me down in his tiny little apartment and he told me that super dream yet again. I mean, there's like 47,000 versions of the super dream in the archives. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't want to hear about the super dream. I wanted to hear about his family. And I found out that his daughter, Rachel, lived close by in Las Cruces, so we went there. And this part I have a little bit in that blog. It was actually quite upsetting because what happened is that when he started talking about Rose, he would get really excited. And I said, by the way, I have interviewed her and she did make these accusations. And he goes, I know. And then this is when he told me his version where he was trying to protect her virginity. But what I didn't include in the book is that afterwards, we're all sitting down having a meal. And then he starts yelling at me, just yelling at me. And every woman in the room, and includes his daughter, his granddaughter, his third wife, and I think one other person, just leave. And I'm with this enraged person who kept saying, I know you, Lorena, I know you. Right. And it's like, you don't know me because I actually had it wasn't fisticuffs, but I was yelling back because I don't like to be yelled at. And I don't think that's, I don't think that's normal. I don't think that's standard. Let me put it this way. I don't think it's standard oral history procedure. It was absolutely necessary. And when I look back at the oral history itself, I have the transcript, I have the tape. All things considered, I think I held my cool pretty well. But what was really interesting to me or telling is that one way I thought we could get there is that I was just going to let him spill all of his anti-Semitic junk on the way there, and hopefully he'd be done. But no, after that whole afternoon, and I was feeling exhausted, we had to drive back to Las Cruces to where he was living in El Paso, and he was right back on the channel of thinking that Jewish people were in control of the media, medicine, yet like Wall Street, 2 or 3 others. So, you have to deal with real people and real personalities when you do oral history. And there's some people who are willing to dismiss it because it's not as legit as something found in the archives. Mm-hmm. To me, oral history, all it does is say you have to be really careful about your sources no matter what, right? They're all fraught, they're all positioned, they're all imperfect. And I think it's better that way to know how carefully we need to construct our understanding of the past, that it is a construction, right?
No, I think it's a good example of how, in some ways, daring the book is, and it needs to be, in part because I think he really did build his family into his movement, right? I mean, they were crucial to the Alianza throughout. And so his own life, his own work really invites that and makes it a really central part. You couldn't just sit down with him in isolation and do a completely objective interview. I mean, that's kind of a myth. I mean, you have to kind of double source things by talking to his family, et cetera. I think there's really an important lesson there. I think we do have a question, a couple questions now in the chat.
Yeah, there's Joan
Cannon. Yeah. Would you say something about early reactions to the book, if you've already had some, from people involved in the story, professional historians, the media?
Yeah, everyone loves it. So it's
which I don't find surprising, I have to say.
It's like yeah. So one, I know I realized I gave you a short blurb, but I forgot to mention it won a big fat prize. From
you tell us, please tell us.
Yes. It won the best book from the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association. So I'm really grateful. And then it won.
Congratulations.
It won. I mean, NBC. I don't even know if people pay attention to NBC anymore. But there's a 10 best books in Latino, 10 best books by and about Latinos. So not just history, but there's like poets and screenplays, and there was Tijerina's book. And the media, the people in New Mexico are really interested. I think the most critical reviews I've gotten is from someone who shows up in the book for about a paragraph or two. Her name is Valentina. And she's from San Luis, Colorado. She's a land grant person. And so she read it. She said, that's all about Tijerina. That's not about us. Like, it's like the book didn't capture the land. In her estimation, the book did not capture land grant struggle. It was too much about him. And I think that she has a point. I also think that unless you write about this man and literally put him in his box, you can't even get to the land grant struggle, because everything about land grant people is read through Tijerina. Like, that's all people ever know about what has gone on and is going on in New Mexico. So when I say I wanted to liberate the land grant struggle from him, it's like, yeah, now he's within these pages. Let's go forward. Yeah. So, and Joan, I just have to tell you that your sister Wendy wrote me. Joan is a former, a retired professor emeritus from the history department, and her sister Wendy is a Nuevo Mexicana for about 55 years. So I just got a note from Wendy. Okay.
Great. And we have another one from Jose Juan Perez Melendez. It's interesting to note the strategic nature of identity categories at play in the book. On the one end, there's the Hispanic or Spanish American, in quotes, labels frequent among Nuevos Mexicanos around the turn of the century. And later there's the idyll with Spain among aliancistas. Then López Tijerina comes along with Indo-Hispano, but later the Chicano movement sidesteps him. Can you share some thoughts about what was at stake in López Tijerina's invention of that category? What could it gain and what could it cost? And I'll ask the second part after that.
Well, I'm gonna say what I like about, what I appreciate with comes along with Indo-Hispano, of course it's a creation, but it's in a creation that acknowledges a native ancestry, like openly acknowledges it, and that hadn't been done, and it was considered unwise. And it was like the thing that distinguished Nuevo Mexicanos, part of their fierce pride was that they had already conquered those Indians, right? They were better than the Indians. They were the ones who came, they were the civilized European connected ancestry. And so Tijerina says, like, no, they're our brothers, they're us, which is also, I know, a gross simplification, but still to acknowledge that really was unusual in especially New Mexican circles, where it was really important to claim it's that the term Spanish American is popular or became popular in New Mexico. The term Hispano, like, emphasize that, which is Spain, was popular in New Mexico. So the idyll with Spain was really about, it really was, let me put it this way. It really came about, it's not like it was always there. It really came about after the American conquest. Because as I say, if you're gonna get along with these Americans, it really helps to emphasize how you're like them, and in this case, how you're white like them, right? And that's, I'm talking about the Americans came in, because not all Americans are white. But later the Chicano movement sidesteps him. It's really a romance between Tijerina and the Chicano movement. On the one hand, his greatest gift to the Chicano movement was to say, your history is important. You were here, you matter, right? It's like, let me tell you about how long Spanish-speaking people have been in this place we now call the American Southwest. Because if you're part of a racial minority that's denigrated, and still happens today, as like the forever foreigner, that's a really powerful stance. That's a liberatory stance that he offered. But the Chicano movement, it's true, some Chicano movement writers, even today, will say like, oh, he wasn't really part of the Chicano movement. He was too old, he was too grouchy, he was not, radical enough. And it's like, that's like after the fact thinking. If you go look at the newspapers at the time, Chicano movement newspapers, they loved him, and it was a mutual love affair. And then extrapolating a fair bit from the book, Jose Juan, he's always going to come up with this really interesting question. I have no idea.
That's very thoughtful.
I would like to
typically
know
thoughtful from Jose Juan.
what you would believe could be the reception of the story within the realm of the new category of Latinx. I think people would appreciate it. I think people would. I mean, Latinx is another, like the idea that Tijerina is always like searching for his identity in a way, or searching for the one that fits, that grants the most political possibility. Latinx is one of those, like, I mean, in my decades on this planet, I've had a lot of different labels, and they're all like tinged with political possibility, and all have limitations. So I think this one would fit right in. I think it would be a good thing. I think the reception would be great. Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about sort of after the courthouse raid had kind of made him famous nationally, internationally, how he fit into the landscape of the protest culture of the 60s? Because I think there were different reactions to him. I think Martin Luther King responded apparently fairly favorably and tried to incorporate him into his movement. But then some of the people back at home in New Mexico were still fighting him and actually pursuing him even legally, right?
So he was a controversial figure in New Mexico from the start, right? He was a controversial figure among American authorities from the start, way before the courthouse raid. So some people loved him and some people hated him. Poor people who lost land tended to love him. People who lost land but made it in the American society tended to think he was a troublemaker. So the pushback after the courthouse raid, he goes into the courthouse. He says he didn't, but he probably did. Shoots up at least one person. He is rocketed to fame, and just because people they were ready. If you remember Cesar Chavez, the grape strike had been going on for a while, and he was a pacifist. Well, here comes this real militant talking about these gross injustices, but people were taken almost with the drama and the cinematic appeal of the courthouse raid. They hadn't a clue who Tijerina was. He was getting these invitations, and people weren't even sure he spoke English. And I'm sure when they heard him and his accent, they still weren't sure, right? I mean, he had a heavy accent. He did speak. I mean, his grammatically was all there. So the love affair between Tijerina and the 1960s social movement really reaches its high point at the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, and it's also the beginning of the end. It's almost like the courthouse raid. A lot of times when people tell the Tijerina story, the courthouse raid is what tells you this is your entry into understanding Tijerina. In my book, it's the end of the road, because he's given all these other flaws and limitations of his personality. You can't take all that national attention and do much with it, except try to reiterate everything you've already said again. And so what it comes across is, instead of this inspirational man with a vision, he sounds like a person who wants more and more for himself. And so it really was a turning point for Tijerina in that regard.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, in New Mexico, though, when he goes and says I'm getting invited by Martin Luther King, I'm getting involved to the New Politics Convention, I'm hanging out with the Black Panthers, I'm meeting with Native American leaders. He's really excited, right? He gets the nickname TV Arena because he's the cameras are there, he's sucking it up. But what's happening is that if you start listening to his speeches and stuff, it's all about the kingdom of justice. There's not a hell of a lot about land. It's not about land grants. It's not about New Mexico. It's about him being a national leader leading to this great, another utopia, this time political, sometime in the near future. So that's also pushback at the level of some of his stalwart supporters are going, what the hell is going on? Especially because so many of them faced so many horrible legal bills after the courthouse raid, and they didn't get any help with Tijerina. Any fundraising went to help Tijerina, this one man, not everyone who participated.
Right, and part of his petering out in the early 70s was also actually doing jail time, right? I mean, the local authorities back in New Mexico were successful in prosecuting him and sending him to prison. I was curious, we're heading towards the end here. What happened to these land grant claims? Because you tell a fascinating anecdote in the book about when you go to meet Tijerina, he wants you to bring a court case with you because he sees hope in a kind of post-2000 court case.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, yeah, there are I just want to make clear, because people are going to he has so many fans, and then so many people hate him, that if this does get on YouTube, what's going to happen is I'm going to get all this, how dare you attack him? It wasn't his limitations. It's he also, as this man with his, we're all flawed. He has some serious limitations. He's also being pursued by the FBI, and his offices are being bombed, and then he has to go to prison. And then, yeah, he's dealing with a lot. So it's hard for someone to navigate all that. And he comes out a different man, so much so that myth among, and it is a myth among Chicano movement activists, is that he had a lobotomy in prison, and that's why he came out such a sweeter, nicer guy, at least for a moment. And then in 2006 or 7, I can't remember, the same, it's in southern San Luis, Colorado. There's a Sangre de Cristo land grant. And finally, Colorado Supreme Court recognizes some pastoral rights for Spanish surname people who've lived there for a long time. And this was like one of the first times the courts actually took the side of land grant activists. But as far as I know, this has not sparked a major revolution. Like the Alianza nor anyone else has ever been able, any organization have ever been able to get land returned or the recognition of land loss as a legitimate cause. Like the US government still thinks that it plays fair and square. And what I really like to compare it to is reparations for the descendants of African slaves and African descent slaves, right? That is always such a impossibility, but every once in a while it comes up in Congress, including now, so that you never know. I mean, it's a long-term struggle, and there's still people on the ground in New Mexico trying to see what they can do.
Great, and maybe you could say a few words about your current project. I'm sure people are curious to hear what you're working on now.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll tell you. So this is what this, it has to be 2 confessions. I don't know how to do it. What I'm not working enough on, but I finally figured it out, because again, it's like graduate students can just save you, right? When you're like in the nest. So I am signed on for to write something completely different that I thought would be really easy, but nothing's very easy. It was within 200 pages, give me the sweep of what I'm calling the Mexican history of the United States. And this is coming out of Beacon Book, which is a popular press. And like, I've taught this history forever, like the history of Mexican descent people in the region that becomes the United States. And I have to be that qualified because it's really weird, borders change and people. So, you know, you start with Spanish conquistadores, and then you end up with someone who, you know, crossed the border 4 minutes ago. And so when I was speaking to a wonderful group of graduate students who meet with me, you can't just dump everything in. You really needed like a guiding rope, and I couldn't find it. And then there were ones that reminded me that every lecture and every course that I teach on Mexican American history is really about, you can't put these people in one box. It's about complicated identity. It really is like the theater in a book, right? So the first chapter about Spanish conquest is really about being conquerors and conquered, and they're immigrants and citizens, and they're Americans and Mexicans. So each chapter is going to revolve around one of the complications of what it means to be Mexican in the United States. And that's what I'm working on right now. So it should be so short and sweet. Yeah, that's a goal.
That sounds wonderful. I mean, I really do think it underscores, I think, one of the key themes of this book, which is that you can't easily categorize these things, right? They deserve full engagement and full attention. Well, that was wonderful, Lorena. Thanks again, and congratulations again on all the these accolades the book is garnering, which fully deserved. I really encourage everyone to read it. As I said, highly readable and totally engaging and intriguing and interesting. So congratulations again, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Jaimey, for your time. You're absolute, yeah.
Our pleasure entirely.
Okay. Adios, adios.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for coming, everybody.